What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today is going to be a very exciting video actually, because we're going to take a look at FSR 3 frame generation and see if AMD GPUs have any sort of an advantage over other vendors like Nvidia, for example. It's going to be 4 different games, 4 different engines, with the first one being Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. And right now we're comparing native resolution 3440 by 1440, which is 1440p ultra wide, that is 8 million pixels. And in this particular scenario, the 4090 has a 13% advantage, but it's also CPU bound. And one of the selling points of frame generation was that you can use it to gain more FPS if you're CPU bound. Alright, so let's begin with the 7900 XTX. On the left, we have native 3440 by 1440 with TAA, where we average 133 FPS. And on the right, we have the 7900 XTX with FSR native AA and FSR 3 frame generation enabled, where we average 187 FPS. That is a gain of 41% in average FPS for the 7900 XTX. That's actually very nice. Now let's take a look at the exact same scenario, but on the RTX 4090. Now you might be asking, why didn't I just keep using TAA instead of using FSR AA on the frame generation side? That's because you can't enable AMD frame generation unless you use FSR AA. That's why I use the same thing on both GPUs. But even though we had higher average FPS on the RTX 4090, we didn't see as big of a gain when we enabled FSR frame generation. As a matter of fact, it was only 23% gain in average FPS versus the 41% we got on the 7900 XTX. So in this particular case, it looks like we got more FPS increase on the 7900 XTX in this game. So I do actually find that to be very interesting. But what about DLSS 3 frame generation? Because all the games I've chosen also have DLSS 3 frame generation. Well, why don't we compare the FPS gains between DLSS frame generation and FSR frame generation on the RTX 4090? On the left, we have the RTX 4090 running with DLAA and DLSS 3 frame generation averaging 174 FPS. And on the right, we have the 4090 with FSR native AA and frame generation enabled. We averaged 185 FPS. So we did actually get a bit more frames using FSR 3 frame generation than DLSS 3. That's about 6% more average FPS with FSR 3 frame generation. Not a huge amount, but it is higher with FSR 3 frame generation. Interesting. So to sum things up then, it looks like in Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, FSR 3 frame generation actually runs better on the AMD GPU. I mean, maybe my methodology isn't perfect, but I found it kind of interesting, and I think it kind of gives us an idea. Because while at native, the 4090 was ahead by 13% with FSR 3 frame generation on both, they're practically identical with 187 and 185 average FPS. The XTX also does have a pretty decent 1% low advantage. But anyway, let's move on to our next game. We'll take a look at Miles Morales. Alright, Miles Morales, 3440 by 1440, native TAA with ray tracing enabled. We seem to have the 4090 is 17% ahead, but again, it's important to remember that the 4090 is actually CPU bound. If you look at the GPU use, it's hovering around 70 to 80%, while the 7900 XTX is maxed out. Why don't we try actually making sure both GPUs are maxed out? We're going to target 4K ultra wide, which is even more demanding than regular 4K, by the way. Let's take a look at that before we examine the frame generation. 4K ultra wide is 5160 by 2160. That's 11 million pixels. Regular 4K, by the way, is 8 million. And now that we're making sure both GPUs are maxed out, The 4090 has an immense lead with ray tracing. It's 64% faster on the averages over the 7900 XTX. Now I point this out because I'm not sure how this affects the frame generation. I don't know, but the point of these videos is to engage in discussions. So anyway, let's examine the FSR3 frame generation results. We're going to begin here with the 7900 XTX. We have native TAA on the left, and on the right we can actually turn on FSR3 frame generation with TAA enabled as well, because this game got the FSR 3.1 update, which is nice. Now, what is the difference? Well, at native TAA, we had 71 average FPS, and with FSR3 frame generation enabled on top, we're at 128 FPS, guys. That is an 80% increase in average FPS. That is really nice. What is it going to be like on the 4090 though? Let's take a look. Well, on the 4090 side, things look actually just as good, if not a little bit better. We had 83 FPS with native TAA on the left, and with FSR3 frame generation on top, we arrived at 150 average FPS. That is a gain of 81% in FPS, and it was 80% on the 7900 XTX. I would say they're both the same. So that is interesting. We had a massive lead on the previous game, Like a Dragon, but in Miles Morales, the gains in percentages are actually identical. Now, how does FSR3 frame generation compare to DLSS 3 frame generation though? Let's take a look. Well, guys, in this case, there actually isn't much of a difference. On the 4090 with FSR frame generation, we arrived at 150 average FPS. And with DLSS frame generation, we're at 147 average FPS. So the FSR3 frame generation is 3 FPS faster. That's definitely within margin of error. But yeah, very interesting how in this game, FSR3 and DLSS 3 ran the same. And also the gains were similar between Nvidia and AMD. Very interesting. Let's take a look at our next game, which is Immortals of Aveum. This is an Unreal Engine 5 game that actually seems to run worse on Nvidia for some reason. Now, this was one of the first Unreal Engine 5 games that I actually did take a look at. I did a 4090 versus 7900 XTX comparison, and it stuttered on the Nvidia GPU for some reason. And that still seems to be the case today. If you look at the frame time graph and 1% lows, it's much smoother on the 7900 XTX. Now, as far as GPU utilization, well, the XTX seems to be close to 99%, whereas the 4090 is all over the place, so it's not even being utilized properly, it seems. But anyway, the XTX is actually faster on the average FPS by 9% and noticeably faster on the 1% lows. But anyway, we're here to look at FSR3 frame gen. And we're going to start with the 7900 XTX as per usual. We have native TAA on the left and FSR native AA with frame generation on the right. So we had an average FPS of 77 at native TAA, and with frame generation enabled, we have 134 average FPS. That's a gain of 74% in average FPS. That's actually very, very good. Again, FSR3 frame generation is doing a pretty good job. Now, this is another game that does not have FSR 3.1, so I am forced to have to use FSR native AA to be able to toggle frame generation on. But how does FSR 3 do on the RTX 4090? Let's take a look at that next. Well, it actually does extremely well. Slightly better than on the 7900 XTX, as a matter of fact. On the XTX, we had a gain of 74%. On the RTX 4090 with FSR native AA and frame generation, we have a 77% gain in average FPS. That is actually kind of unusual, but very similar to how it was with Miles Morales. And I have to actually say that with FSR 3 frame generation, our 1% lows are in the 70s. So definitely much smoother with FSR 3 frame generation. And we're going to take a look at DLSS 3 frame generation next and see how that compares to FSR 3 frame generation. But I am very impressed with FSR frame generation. AMD's knocked it out of the park with this one. Okay, so DLSS 3 frame generation versus FSR 3 frame generation. How do they compare? Well, actually, they're very comparable. Although FSR 3 frame generation does have a slight lead in average FPS, we have 126 average FPS with FSR 3 native AA and 120 average FPS with DLSS 3 frame generation. So again, very comparable. But FSR 3 has a lead, and it also has a bit of a lead on the 1% lows. So I'm starting to see a pattern here. Very nice. But we have one more game to take a look at, and it's going to be Horizon Forbidden West, where we got the FSR 3.1 upgrade. Well, let's see. Is FSR going to run better on the AMD GPU this time? So far, it's only been one game where AMD had a clear lead advantage. In Horizon Forbidden West, the 7900 XTX and RTX 4090 are actually quite comparable. I've done a separate video looking at multiple resolutions. Actually, both GPUs perform similarly in this game, but for the sake of this comparison, at 3440 by 1440 native TAA, the 4090 has a 9% lead on average FPS, while the 7900 XTX has a bit of a lead on the 1% lows by a couple FPS. But what about FSR 3 frame generation? We're going to start with the 7900 XTX, and because this game got the FSR 3.1 update, we can actually keep TAA on both sides. So on the left, we have the 7900 XTX native TAA, where we average 110 FPS. And on the right, we have the 7900 XTX TAA plus FSR 3 frame generation, where we averaged 185 FPS, guys. That's an increase of 75 FPS, which is around 68% gain in average FPS from FSR 3 frame generation. That is a very nice increase to the visual fluidity of the game, I have to say. And it does actually look really nice. And what about the RTX 4090? Is it going to be able to match FSR 3 on the 7900 XTX like it did the last two games? Not so much. At native 3440 by 1440 TAA, we averaged 120 FPS on the RTX 4090. And by turning FSR 3 frame generation, we actually didn't gain all that much. We averaged 145 FPS. That is a gain of 21%. That is a lot less than the 7900 XTX's 68% gain in average FPS. Interestingly, we have an FSR 3.1 update game where FSR 3 frame generation runs quite a bit better on an AMD GPU. But then again, we also had FSR 3.1 in Miles Morales, where the gains were actually the same between both Nvidia and AMD. So this is kind of interesting, and I wonder what causes it to be either one way or the other. I mean, sometimes we even had a bit higher increase in average FPS on the Nvidia side. But yeah, this is a win for AMD on Horizon Forbidden West. Now, how does DLSS compare in all this? Because we didn't gain a ton of FPS with FSR 3 on the 4090. Well, DLSS does actually generate more frames. Not a huge difference. I mean, we were averaging 145 with FSR 3 frame generation, and with DLSS frame generation, we average 158 FPS. So that's a 9% increase over FSR 3 on the 4090. Still, the 7900 XTX with frame generation enabled is noticeably ahead over the 4090 with either DLSS or FSR 3. How ahead is it? 17% in average FPS. With 4090 and DLSS frame generation, we averaged 158 FPS, and on the 7900 XTX with FSR 3 frame generation, we averaged 185 FPS. So yeah, the 7900 XTX was able to beat the 4090 with both frame generations enabled on each respective GPU. So yeah, this was a very interesting comparison because it was something that I had heard people say, but it's also something that I did notice myself in some games, so I wanted to put it to the test. I chose 4 of these games because I figured they were all somewhat different from one another, and they have different engines, different versions of FSR even, so I figured this was a good sample choice. But I don't know, what do you guys think? Do you agree with my methodology? Is it flawed? Let me know down below. This was just for fun. I was just curious. So yeah, here we are. And these are the results that I was able to find. Let me know what you think down below. And like the video if you liked it. And subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I appreciate you watching. And have a good weekend. Bye.